Acknowledgements. Read by the author, Adam Mead. This book could not have happened without much help, support, encouragement, and luck. First and foremost, I thank Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, whose business creation is topped only by their genuine skill and passion for teaching. I'm grateful for the many founders, managers, and employees who carefully built each part of Berkshire into what it is today, and for those who will continue its legacy. I'm lucky to follow in the footsteps of some incredible Berkshire scholars. Not least among them is Lawrence Cunningham, who went above and beyond to find me financial filings at the Library of Congress, in addition to reading an early draft of the manuscript. The staff at the Boston Public Library were incredibly helpful in researching Berkshire's early history. A special thank you to Todd Wheeler for lending me his signed copy of Phil Buse's Limping on Water and recounting the story of his career at Capital Cities ABC. These provided invaluable insights into the management philosophy of Tom Murphy and Dan Burke. Thank you to Carol Loomis for her early help with this project. My good friends Andrew Wagner and Carter Johnson provided ideas, support, and guidance throughout the process of crafting Berkshire's history. I'm thankful for Guy Spear's friendship and support, and his reminder of just how special Berkshire's culture is. Chris Bloomstrand provided invaluable suggestions and helped me find the right voice to convey Berkshire's long history. Jonathan Brandt suggested improvements to key parts of the manuscript. Marcy, Margaret, and Sarah Hawley, along with John Baskin, provided great ideas and helped me better understand the world of publishing. Jesse Rancourt enthusiastically read a draft of the manuscript and provided excellent feedback. Jeff Anello's detailed critique not only made the book better, but helped me clarify its intended audience. Gautam Bade shared his experience writing and publishing The Joys of Compounding and encouraged me to paint my own canvas. I'm also thankful for Ron Lazzaro's encouragement and keen eye on a later draft of the manuscript. I wouldn't have found my new friends at Harriman House without Dan Pico and Austin Pierce. Craig Pierce at Harriman was a joy to work with and shared my enthusiasm for bringing the full story of Berkshire Hathaway to life in a first-class way. Chris Parker created a beautiful cover that conveys the feeling of Berkshire in one concise snapshot. The care and devotion of the typesetting work done by Chris Wilde shows on every page. Eric Wing and Likana Lee at MetroCreate crafted a beautiful companion website at theoraclesclassroom.com. They found ways to bring my particular and exacting ideas to life, which I know wasn't easy. My editor, Erica Allison Cohen, became a trusted partner and friend along this long journey. Her work can only be fully appreciated next to the raw material I provided her. She proved not only an excellent editor, but a patient teacher as well. Two individuals not directly related to this project deserve attention for their contributions. The first is my high school welding instructor at Pinkerton Academy, Mr. Kopp. He taught his students that a weld could be the best and strongest in the world, but if it looked sloppy, no one would fully appreciate it. I've used that lesson as a metaphor in every walk of life since leaving his class. I must also thank Gary Vaynerchuk. He doesn't know it yet, but his message of pursuing one's passions with empathy and energy, no matter how small the audience, kept me going to the finish line. Finally, and most important of all, I thank my wife, Shelley. I'm incredibly lucky to have a loving partner who supports my endeavors, even ones that turn out bigger and much longer than originally envisioned. No project of this magnitude could be completed without a trusted companion by one's side to keep the rest of the world in order while pouring heart and soul onto the page. For all this help, many mistakes and omissions undoubtedly remain. To someone now accustomed to the world of electronic media, a printed book preserving these faults in time is a terrifying prospect. They are mine alone.
Foreword by Christopher Bloomstrand. The Library of Congress contains more than 200 volumes devoted to Berkshire Hathaway and the two gentlemen adorning the cover of this book. Add in newspaper and magazine articles, research reports, investment letters, social media messages, and Berkshire's own financial reporting and archives of its annual meetings, and it is safe to conclude that more has been written on the company and the two men running it than on any other business over the past 3 decades. perhaps over all time. The question must therefore be asked, why another book? I know I speak for countless others when I say Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger are my mentors, not in the classic sense, but for having had such a profoundly positive impact on my life as an investor and as a citizen. It's hard to believe for the quarter century following 1965, when Mr. Buffett bought control of Berkshire Hathaway, that he and the company were generally flying under the radar. Despite having compounded Berkshire's book value per share at 24% and its shares by 28% annually against only a 10% return for the Standard & Poor's 500 index, Berkshire, Buffett, and Munger were not household names in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Today, of course, Mr. Buffett and Munger are worldwide rock stars, and Berkshire Hathaway is no longer just a company but a cult. Back then, I never heard those names uttered when I studied finance. Outside of the MBA program at Columbia University and a handful of schools with oddball professors, early Berkshire cultists to be sure, these three didn't exist on campuses. Following school, I worked at a large Midwestern bank in trust investments. We didn't own or even follow Berkshire. To the old guard, it was regarded as just an insurance company that's really no more than a leveraged mutual fund. When I studied for the CFA designation in the early 1990s, I only first learned of Berkshire when reading about the efficient market hypothesis and a highly regarded finance academician pointing to the company and to Mr. Buffett as aberrant lucky anomalies. In 1996, those aberrant anomalies issued their Class B shares to the public, and I set out to learn about the unusual company that would, on the first page of the offering document, admonish prospective shareholders that the shares being offered are not undervalued. The company will not grow as fast prospectively as in the past. The shares in recent years advance faster than intrinsic value, so to expect underperformance. The offering size is tailored to meet the expected demand, so not to expect a quick profit. Who does this? I found and purchased a copy of the reprinting of the fourth edition of Benjamin Graham's The Intelligent Investor, on the cover of which Mr. Buffett claimed, "By far the best book on investing ever written." It is. The copy also contained bonus material, a new introduction and also an appendix, both written by Mr. Buffett. The appendix was an edited transcript of a talk given at Columbia University in 1984, commemorating the 50th anniversary of Ben Graham and David Dodd's security analysis. The speech was titled "The Super Investors of Graham and Doddsville." In a modern context, it would be an instant classic. As has been the case for so many investors, that was it. I read the entire book that night and read it again the following night. The light had gone on. Common occurrence for those first encountering this Grahamian Buffett approach for the first time. For Graham, it was immediately on to Berkshire Hathaway. Despite having a research library nearly as large as a basketball court, the bank didn't have any annual reports on the Buffett-led conglomerate. Those were the days when you had to call a company to get reports. The 1993 to 1995 annuals, the three I'd requested, contained the most unusual chairman's letters, which not only informed but taught. Ben Graham taught. It was obvious that Mr. Buffett modeled his own approach from his mentor and took it upon himself to educate as well, a giving back so contrary to what most would do. In a field as competitive as investments, why give away the secret sauce, the formula for Coca-Cola, when it would be so easy to copy? Back then, one could write to Berkshire's offices in Omaha, and the company would mail you a 3-volume bound set of chairman's letters dating back to 1977. I can't recall how many times I've read these letters. Those pages contain pure gold for the young, aspiring investor. Value investing took on an entirely new meaning. Nowhere else could you learn so logically about accounting, good and bad, valuation, stock-based compensation, corporate governance, the vagaries of inflation and taxes, derivatives as weapons of mass destruction, and the list goes on and on. I bought shares of Berkshire Hathaway for the first time in February 2000. The stock had fallen by half from 1998 and offered seeming value. How much value I would only appreciate as the years passed, and the position size and my affection for all things Berkshire abounded. The annual shareholders meeting by then had become a thing, so off to Omaha as a first-time shareholder that April 29th I went. I've only missed one meeting since, the following year when my firstborn arrived just days prior to the meeting. Every year my understanding accumulated, taking in the wisdom offered so selflessly by the sages on the dais. Some would diligently scribe every word and provide transcripts of the discussion. I owe tremendous thanks to those that did, and so many of you are now great friends. Now, the video recordings of these meetings have been graciously provided to CNBC, and a wonderful online archive of every meeting back to 1994 is available free of charge and beautifully done. Even at critical moments, often at times of uncertainty or panic, Mr. Buffett would take to Fortune magazine and pen articles that put fears to rest or reset expectations. Mr. Munger would host his own annual meetings in Pasadena and Los Angeles for Westco Financial, and more recently the Daily Journal. Transcripts and recordings of the long Berkshire archive abound. So again, why another book? When you read this monumental effort by Adam Mead, the answer will be obvious. Despite all of the annual reports, all of the letters, all of the books, all of the interviews and annual meetings, none have done what history required. We, the investors, the students of capital allocation, history really, needed the complete chronology of Berkshire Hathaway, dating to its days pre-Buffett, when the original textile businesses that became today's Berkshire thrived, and then did not. With Mr. Buffett's encouragement, Adam has written the complete business and investment history of the company, leaving no acquisition, no investment, no cycle uncovered. He assimilated all of the annual reports, meeting transcripts, and myriad other information and compacted it into this terrific, readable work. Biographies can be interesting and entertaining, but this detailed history of the greatest company and greatest of all time investors the world has ever seen was necessary. The reader should pay special attention to the evolution of Mr. Buffett and of Berkshire. Over time, the business has undergone dramatic change. From the early pivot away from its New England textile origins to insurance, to subsequent well-timed transitions, to and away from common stocks, to the outright ownership of businesses, the allocation of capital was brilliant. The book captures an evolving genius and ability to be presciently and invariably ahead of the crowd. It's as though Berkshire became the embodiment of the epigraph introducing security analysis from Horace's Ars Poetica. Many shall be restored that now are fallen, and many shall fall that are now in honor. You will find the book arranged in a manner where information and details can be easily located and referenced, but read cover to cover. Both the uninitiated to Berkshire and its most ardent followers will derive enormous utility and satisfaction from it. Privileged to get an early preview of the manuscript, despite my 25 years as a now self-described Berkshire cultist, I learned so many new and important things about Berkshire and its history. It is my pleasure to encourage you to enjoy this gem. I owe so much of my investment career and investing framework to the lessons of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. We all owe a heartfelt thanks to Adam Mead for writing the book on Berkshire that needed to be written. Well done, Adam. Christopher P. Bloomstrand, President and Chief Investment Officer, Semper Augustus Investments Group. Tables and charts. Associated with this manuscript is a PDF document listing all the charts and tables that are mentioned throughout the narrative. By their very nature, each is a picture, and 1,000 words would not do even the smallest of them justice with regards to the message it was created to convey. Each table and chart will add further depth to the narrative to which it is referenced, and more importantly, taken as a whole, will give the listener a visual showing the amazing growth of Berkshire Hathaway from its relatively simple beginnings to its place among the Fortune 500. While the manuscript alone is an amazing source of information and will provide the listener a vivid picture of Berkshire Hathaway and its two masters of capital allocation, the listener is strongly encouraged to have the PDF document available and to pause the audio and view the reference table or chart to get the full impact of the associated narrative. Introduction. Saturday, May 5th, 2012. Omaha, Nebraska, 5:30 a.m. I am waiting in line to get into the arena for the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. I am a first-timer. A group of guys from Cincinnati, Ohio welcomes me into their ritual of charging in to get seats on the floor close to Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. We charge with the politeness of men in suits and the excitement of teenage girls seeing the Beatles in concert for the first time. I just found 40,000 friends who share a love for Berkshire. On that day, I never could have imagined I'd have the chutzpah, to use a Charlie Munger term, to someday write a book on Berkshire Hathaway. Yet that first meeting was the beginning of a journey that led to what you now hold in your hands. I listened intently to the Oracle of Omaha and the witty Munger for hours and experienced firsthand the 200,000 square foot exhibition hall, which was truly a one-of-a-kind blend of celebration, reunion, trade show, and shopping spree. Dinner at Gorat's that evening with my new companions from Cincinnati solidified friendships which remain to this day. I've attended every annual meeting since, including the virtual one in 2020 due to COVID-19, and my friendships with wonderful people from all over the world are now too numerous to count. Over the years, I've had the great fortune to meet fellow Berkshire shareholders, operating managers, and some directors during the annual meeting weekend. Two highlights were shaking Warren's hand during one of his stints working as salesman Crazy Warren at Borsheim's, and shaking the hand of investing great Jack Bogle. The bigger names like Buffett and Bogle garner press beyond the business world. Others like Ron Olson, Irv Blumkin, Tony Nicely, Todd Combs, and Ted Weschler occupy fame within the Berkshire and investing community. Countless others like Kathy Sorensen at Johns Manville, Greg Renner at Mytech, and the many managers, employees, and members of the Berkshire home office team are lesser known but equally critical in creating the fabric that make up Berkshire's culture. My insatiable curiosity and thirst for everything Berkshire grew as I collected annual meeting passes, books about Berkshire, and new friends. Yet even with the volume of books written about Berkshire, I found myself pining for something more. I wanted to go deeper than Warren's chairman's letters and see the numbers that made him so excited about the businesses and Berkshire's future. I wanted to understand the accounting and the reasons why certain acquisitions were made. I wanted to see how the company evolved from a struggling textile company to a respected Fortune 500 company. I wanted to follow its evolution chronologically in one place. Not finding such a volume anywhere, I set out to create it using my knowledge of Berkshire and my skills as a former commercial loan officer and current investment manager. I've long harbored the idea of a project that would take years to complete and perhaps test the limits of my penchant for deferred gratification. Half a decade wasn't my original plan, but here we are. I formalized my quest in 2016, which took me on a journey digesting over 10,000 pages of written material, including Moody's manuals on the early Berkshire predecessor companies dating to the 1920s. Each Berkshire Hathaway annual report from 1955 to 2019, totaling some 4,000 plus pages, including 900 plus pages of chairman's letters, most of Berkshire's 10Ks, and many of the 10Qs. I listened to and read the transcripts of each annual meeting from 1994 to 2020, 140 plus hours of video, and 3,000 plus pages. Analyzed financial filings and annual reports from subsidiary companies where they were available, read newspaper and magazine accounts, books on subsidiary companies, and of course the multitude of other works on Berkshire completed over the decades. The structure of this book follows my deep-seated inclination towards logic and order. The foundation rests on the annual reports and especially during the Buffett years on the chairman's letters. The goal was to add to Buffett's analysis of each year and not outdo him, but go deeper and ask why and how. Each decade leads with a financial snapshot, including key acquisitions and noteworthy events. Each decade ends with a review of the major events, key lessons, and appendices with detailed financials. In this way, the book is a guide through 55 years of history, both in long form and in review. The book is the synthesis of many materials filtered through the mind of one individual. It's not perfect and it is biased. With so many facts, figures, and calculations covering many years, it is certain that errors exist. I'd be grateful to know where I erred. Please email me at brkbook@gmail.com. The longtime Berkshire shareholder or well-versed student will recognize additional possible shortfalls. When a business conglomerate covers more than 5 decades, even an exhaustive history requires cutting. What deserves to remain or be eliminated is not an easy task. The calculations in charts could lead to questions, as could information left out. I hope the book provides a single place to satisfy those looking to drink from the fire hose that is all the wonderful details of Berkshire Hathaway. Perhaps future editions will include additional information deemed critical, and the true fanatic can, and should, go through as much original source material as possible. I envision 2 broad audiences for this book. One is the new student of Berkshire or investing who wants to live through the company's history as it happened year by year. That individual will gain an incredible appreciation for the process and decisions that transformed a struggling textile company into what it is today. They will better understand how to think about businesses, which will undoubtedly make them better at investing. To use another Mungerism, how could it be otherwise? The second broad audience is the longtime student or shareholder of Berkshire. For this audience, the book may serve more as a reference guide, a refresher on a particular year or years, quickly digestible compared to the full financials. With a chronological layout, the book is compartmentalized to allow easy study of a particular year or decade. The layout of the chapters may seem an odd choice at first, but there's a logic to it. Using Buffett's arrival in 1965 as the point of origin, I first went back a decade to see what the company looked like between 1955 and 1964. When I sent the first chapter to Warren, he suggested going back even further to examine the brief respite of profitability the predecessor companies experienced during World War II before resuming their economic slide. Having made the jump back in time, I couldn't stop. My curiosity wanted to know where all the predecessor companies came from. Thus, the book starts in the 18th century and follows the development of the textile industry. The first chapters examine the rise of the textile industry in New England from its origins, combining proprietary textile manufacturing technology taken from England with seed capital harvested from a declining whaling industry. We see the shift of textile dominance to the South as technology changed the economics of the industry. We follow the Berkshire predecessor companies through the 1930s and 1940s and see the challenges of the 1930s wipe out a host of textile companies before World War II showers profits on those that remained. Then we see the struggles return as foreign competition slowly begins decimating another once powerful industry. The year 1955 conveniently begins the decade Berkshire Fine Spinning Associates and Hathaway Manufacturing merged to create Berkshire Hathaway. Most surprising of all are the capital allocation decisions made by Buffett's predecessors. While Berkshire Hathaway was a business in decline and its managers stubborn, they acted rationally by shrinking the business and returning capital to shareholders. Those actions weren't enough to keep the stock price from falling below a level that attracted a young investment manager who saw a price-value discrepancy to exploit. We begin in earnest in 1965. The year Buffett gained control of Berkshire and learned how hard it was to make money in textiles. Working capital and physical plant must do the job, not just the market's reevaluation of those assets in relation to the stock price. Textile business would drag down Berkshire's operating results and cause headaches for another 20 years. Yet those challenges provided crucial business lessons. One lesson was that even the most talented management team can't save a business with bad economics. Another was how swiftly capital allocation could shift the fortunes of a company for the better, which in this decade were the two large acquisitions of National Indemnity, 1967, and the Illinois National Bank and Trust of Rockford, 1969. These bold moves represented 28% and 44% of Berkshire's average equity capital at the time of purchase, respectively. By 1974, Berkshire was well on its way to changing course. Between 1975 and 1984, Berkshire grew exponentially through acquisitions and investments, most notably the increased investment in the eventual merger with Blue Chip Stamps. With Buffett and Munger in control of Blue Chip, it purchased See's Candies in 1972, began purchasing Wesco in 1973, and acquired the Buffalo News in 1977. Berkshire also merged with Diversified Retailing in 1978. This decade is highlighted by Berkshire's entrepreneurial push into insurance and its entry into reinsurance. Berkshire hits its stride in the 1985-1994 decade. Ajit Jain joins Berkshire and begins building an insurance powerhouse focused squarely on profitability. This is the decade where float swells and investment income far surpasses any underwriting losses. The leveraged buyout fad of this time allows Berkshire to acquire Scott Fetzer, itself a mini conglomerate, and Fetchheimer. It also provides an opportunity for Berkshire to back Capital Cities in its bid for ABC. Berkshire invests $1.3 billion in Coca-Cola during this decade, a cost basis that remains unchanged today. The decade was also marked by challenges, most notably the Solomon Treasury bid rigging episode, which required 9 months of Buffett's time while he worked to rescue Berkshire's $700 million investment and his reputation. Berkshire's investment in U.S. Air nearly collapses, and its investment in footwear quickly deteriorates. The 1995-2004 decade sees Berkshire build out the framework of its future. The acquisition of the remaining half of Geico that it didn't already own solidifies its presence in primary insurance, and its acquisition of General Reinsurance brings initial headaches but creates a reinsurance powerhouse. Both moves add to the huge amounts of capital Buffett and Munger can allocate. One outlet for capital is the utility sector, which provides predictable returns and the ability to invest large sums, but with limited upside potential. The boom and subsequent bust of the dot-com wave also creates opportunities for Berkshire to welcome discarded but cash-generating businesses into its protective umbrella. The 2005-2014 decade, the fifth under Buffett's control, sees additional large non-insurance acquisitions, including a major international one. The Great Recession mid-decade provides Berkshire an opportunity to put large amounts of capital to work in a short period of time. It also tees up the acquisition of Burlington Northern Santa Fe, which expands upon the utility platform acquired the prior decade by adding another large company with regulated investment returns and a place to make big investments. The largest reinsurance deals in history highlight Berkshire's willingness to use its capital strength when opportunities present themselves. Finally, a half-decade period covering 2015 to 2019 proves Buffett's assertion that Berkshire's incredible past record would weigh on future returns. Over 40% of the change in shareholders' equity between 1965 and 2019 occurred in these 5 years and proved the power of compounding. Berkshire's rate of return, however, falls to its lowest level in its modern history. A poor result only in comparison to its own record and impressive considering the size of the conglomerate and its conservative balance sheet, including huge holdings of treasuries. Berkshire makes several large investments during this period, including a partnership that takes control of Heinz and Kraft Foods. Its $35 billion investment in Apple demonstrates Berkshire's consistent pattern of making concentrated investments. Yet, cash continues to build in an economy where private transactions and public equity markets are expensive by historical standards. Berkshire thus increasingly returns capital to shareholders in a series of share repurchases that may be the pattern for the remainder of the decade. The world is given a glimpse into succession with the promotions of Greg Abel and Ajit Jain to vice chairman. Yet Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, aged 89 and 95 respectively at the end of 2019, show no sign of slowing down. Taking a step back, we see Berkshire Hathaway among the greatest of human achievements. Berkshire's financial outcomes were a result of business mastery, the perfection of a system that cultivated human potential. The capitalist system put in place by America's founding fathers and the incredible tailwinds of the mid-20th century proved the rich soil to allow the genius of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger to flourish. The full story of Berkshire Hathaway is worth understanding for what it can teach us about continuing timeless methods of excellence in business and in life. As long as this book is, I hope to continue to add more to the understanding of Berkshire Hathaway over time. To that end, I have created a website called The Oracle's Classroom, www.theoraclesclassroom.com, which contains an Excel file with the financial statements presented in the chapter appendices, an interactive Berkshire timeline, an archive of Berkshire and subsidiary financials, book recommendations, a blog, and more. I look forward to hearing from readers, shareholders, students, and others, as well as continue our journey as students of this remarkable conglomerate and as creators. Adam Mead, Derry, New Hampshire, November 2020. Chapter 1. Textile Conglomerate. A proper history of Berkshire Hathaway prior to Warren Buffett taking control in 1965 could occupy an entire book unto itself. When we think of the conglomerate that is Berkshire Hathaway today, we think of a widely diverse enterprise spanning a multitude of different industries. The 1965 version was a large textile company comprised of many companies with stories of their own. The rise and fall of an industry. What gave rise to those textile companies and the industry itself is fascinating and instructive. We must therefore start at the beginning. Samuel Slater brought the first water-powered textile mill to the United States in 1789. Slater snuck out of England with the know-how to build a viable water-powered mill and did so with financial backers in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. By 1809, there were 27 Slater-type mills in New England. The next major innovation was financial and operational. Francis Cabot Lowell, a wealthy Boston merchant, used a joint stock corporation to create the Boston Manufacturing Company in 1813. He was the first to integrate his mills, the first of which was in Waltham, Massachusetts. It housed all operations needed to turn raw cotton into finished cloth. They were profitable almost immediately. Lowell had thus discovered the optimal combination of size and integration to generate economies of scale out of the cotton mill. Not surprisingly, this innovation spread rapidly. Having wrested all the power they could out of the Charles River in Waltham, the investors in the Boston Manufacturing Company, sometimes referred to as the Boston Associates, turned their sights on a new location. They chose a site on the Merrimack River in what was East Chelmsford, Massachusetts, and formed the Merrimack Manufacturing Company. In Lowell, the company was more than just mills. It was a company town that by the 1840s had over 8,000 employed. They used the surrounding farmland to build a boarding house, churches, company stores, and other infrastructure for the many workers required to operate the mills. Many of the workers were women. The next major improvement in textile mill operations came from the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company, formed in the late 1830s in Manchester, New Hampshire, along the Merrimack River. Whereas the Lowell-type mills were individually owned, the Amoskeag mills operated under one corporate umbrella. This allowed for bulk purchasing, sales, and other economies of scale. Why the North? The early mills in the United States were thousands of miles from cotton fields, which raises a question: why develop a textile industry in the North? In short, the South did not find it immediately economical to do so, and the North had some distinct advantages, at least initially. Two initial Northern advantages were access to capital and a cheap power source. Availability of capital was possibly the deciding factor as to why the textile industry first took hold in the Northeast. When Francis Cabot Lowell formed the Boston Manufacturing Company, he was already a successful businessman. He and his Boston associates had access to capital from the whaling business. By the mid-1800s, a large store of capital accumulated during the boom times of whaling was unleashed as whaling declined and the textile business grew. Other advantages of the North were geographic. New England has many strong flowing rivers that unleashed vast amounts of power as they descended to the ocean. These rivers also provided a convenient means of transporting goods to and from the mills. Secondly, the North's proximity to New York City, known as the fashion capital, may also have played a part, since the Northeast knew sooner which products were most popular. After all, information traveled much more slowly then. According to the Decline of the Textile City, a study of New Bedford, the New England region obtained a virtual monopoly in textiles with 70% of the active spindles in the United States housed there. By 1880, New England boasted more than 80% of active spindles. This would prove to be the height of success for New England textile manufacturing. It would only go down from there. This time also saw increased competition due to the formation of many new textile companies looking to get into the then prosperous industry. Quick additions to capacity would be the hallmark of the textile industry during good times. It would ultimately lead to depressed prices. Between the 1880s and the late 1920s, the North slowly lost its supremacy in textile manufacturing. As the economic landscape shifted, early advantages turned into shackles that accelerated the industry decline in the North. A major factor was a slow, grinding technical obsolescence. While the South first found it advantageous to grow the raw material to supply the northern mills, the South's late entrance allowed it to incorporate newer, more efficient machines such as automatic looms and ring spindles. Owners of northern plants found it hard to justify the new expenditures given their plants' marginal profitability. Over time, the gap between the North and the South widened, hastening the shift south. The shift away from water-powered plants also hurt the North. The North's strong rivers gave it an advantage over the South in the early days, but the rivers could only provide so much power. The South, by contrast, soon incorporated steam power into its mills, aided by a proximity to coal. When electricity became a viable source of energy to power the mills, the South too had a slight advantage, as large electrical power plants were less prevalent in the North. Other deciding factors favoring the South over the North were lower labor costs, including the effects of unionization, and lower taxes. Later, the addition of air conditioning neutralized the North's advantage over the unbearable heat of the South. The gap was also due to increasing demand for long fiber cotton from west of the Mississippi, which saw no shipping advantages in the North over the South. Perhaps because the decline of the North's advantages was slow, it didn't see the long-term trends happening in plain sight. Periods of prosperity occasionally happened, such as during shortages of cotton caused by natural events or war. And when new uses for textiles were found, such as incorporation into billiard balls, tires, conveyor belts, and typewriter ribbons, Northern mills quickly grabbed the business. But as had been the case before, the good times quickly led to bitter competition. By the time some of the Berkshire Hathaway predecessor companies were merging in 1929, the industry was facing mostly headwinds. The North would try but fail to reclaim its dominance in the industry that defined the region for decades. The first step entailed a series of mergers and acquisitions that diminished the sheer number of competitors. Berkshire Fine Spinning Associates Incorporated. The oldest predecessor company with identifiable direct connections to the Berkshire Hathaway of today is the Valley Falls Company. According to the Woonsocket, Rhode Island history, the Valley Falls Company was formed by Oliver Chase in 1839. The Chase family built a textile empire that brought prosperity to the villages of Cumberland and Central Falls, Rhode Island, as the family built and expanded its mills along the river. From there, the history unfolds through a series of companies throughout New England as outlined below. 1929. 5 companies, including Valley Falls Company, merged to form Berkshire Fine Spinning Associates Incorporated. The other 4 were Coventry Company, formed in 1864 in Coventry, Rhode Island; Greylock Mills, formed in 1880 in Pittsfield, Massachusetts; Fort Dummer Mills, formed in 1910 in Brattleboro, Vermont; Berkshire Cotton Manufacturing Company, formed in 1889 in Adams, Massachusetts. Berkshire Cotton Manufacturing was the largest of the 5, so the new entity was named Berkshire Fine Spinning Associates Incorporated. 1930. King Philip Mills, formed in 1871 in Fall River, Massachusetts, and Parker Mills, formed in 1895 in Fall River, Massachusetts, merged into Berkshire Fine Spinning. Parker Mills had merged with Hargraves Mills in 1921 after both Parker and Hargraves fell into financial difficulties. 1955. This myriad group of textile mills and companies merged with the Hathaway Manufacturing Company to create Berkshire Hathaway. Hathaway Manufacturing Company. The history of the Hathaway side of Berkshire Hathaway is more straightforward. It was formed in 1888 at the height of textile manufacturing in New England, incorporated in 1889 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and operated independently until the 1955 merger with Berkshire Fine Spinning. Hathaway was formed with $400,000 of initial capital from Horatio Hathaway and several partners looking for their next business venture after the decline of New Bedford's sperm whaling industry, according to filings with the Massachusetts Secretary of State. One of those partners was Hetty Green, the rich heiress to a New Bedford shipping fortune. 1930s. The 2 Berkshire Hathaway predecessor companies, Berkshire Fine Spinning and Hathaway Manufacturing, operated on parallel tracks throughout the 1930s. They largely faced the same struggles as New England-based textile manufacturers, including the relentless march south and the growing influence of overseas competition. The Great Depression in the 1930s acutely affected New England textile manufacturers. The mills that had survived that far had largely done so by shifting production away from the coarser goods and toward the finer textiles that the South had not yet mastered. The Great Depression had softened demand for these higher-priced discretionary fine goods. Many mills saw production of fine goods fall by over 50%, while volumes of coarser-grade staples fell less than 1%. New England mills, including the Berkshire Hathaway predecessor companies, also shifted some production to silk and rayon during the 1930s. These 2 cotton substitutes were naturally suited for manufacturing in the North, at least initially, due to their similarities to fine-grade cotton. Hathaway Manufacturing shifted to these substitutes earlier, making it and another New Bedford mill that did the same the Gosnold Mill, the most profitable in the region. Since material cost for cotton and its substitutes was largely market-driven, mill owners looked to the next largest cost, wages. Workers responded with strikes and walkouts, including the uprising of '34, in which a general textile strike impacted the entire industry. While both North and South were affected, the strike was more concentrated in the South. During the uprising of '34, 500,000 mill laborers walked off the job. The North self-interestingly lobbied against working conditions in the South. The South had lower wages and did not have the same restrictions against child labor, working hours, or working conditions that the North had imposed. With the implementation of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, a standard uniform wage nationwide mitigated the labor differential between the North and the South. The North rejoiced, but it was bittersweet since the legislation came too late. As described in The Decline of a Textile City, a study of New Bedford, the new law could not bring back mills which were already liquidated, whose machinery was sold at auction, and whose buildings had been torn down. It also did nothing to stop the growing impact of overseas competition. Some efforts to stem the shift of production to the South succeeded, but the forces against the North were strong. Data on spindles in place, a measure of industry capacity, illustrates the shift. Figure 1.1 shows the overall decline of the industry between 1914 and 1938, and the large gains by southern cotton-growing states over that period. The U.S. shares of spindles in place in New England fell from 54% in 1914 to 26% in 1938, less than half its 1914 share. Meanwhile, the southern cotton-growing states experienced the opposite trend, growing from 34% of spindles in place in 1914 to 71% of the total, a gain 1 percentage point greater than New England's loss. It is interesting to note that in 1925, the peak of textile production was almost evenly split, with 46% in the South and 48% in the North. Data for Berkshire Fine Spinning Associates and Hathaway Manufacturing during the 1930s conform to the industry trends. Though early 1930s data is scarce, one can assume that the Berkshire Hathaway predecessor companies fared similar to the industry and regional counterparts. Beginning with 1934, data on both constituent companies can be examined, and that is when the differences start to appear. The most obvious difference is operational size. Berkshire had 10 times more spindles than Hathaway and over 6 times more looms. This production capacity, though, did not translate into profitability. The last 5 years of the 1930s, a short but illuminating period, shows how Hathaway had a positive return on equity and Berkshire had none. The natural question is why? Both mills produced largely the same products of finer grade cotton, and both had picked up silk and rayon production. While 5 years is probably the shortest time for an examination of this sort, since many factors can come into play in the short run, the answer is likely due to 2 elements. Hathaway's mills were all located in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and all had the relative advantage of proximity to sea transport. Some Berkshire mills were close to the sea, but the company also had plants as far as western Massachusetts and Vermont. The transport disadvantages of those geographically diverse plants, coupled with Berkshire managing an interstate network of plants, likely weighed on profitability. 1940s. The difficult operating conditions of the northern textile mills in the 1930s likely would have continued unabated throughout the 1940s if it weren't for one major event. World War II created a temporary boom for the entire textile industry and offered the remaining mills in the North a brief flash of extreme profitability. Profits continued for northern mills, albeit briefly, through the 1940s as the U.S. economy brought itself out of the Great Depression, aided largely by consumers' ability and willingness to spend. Very short flickers of profitability would periodically happen after this, but the 1940s would prove to be the last hurrah for the northern mills. The 1940s wartime boom might have dissipated profitability for individual firms if it weren't for the many failures during the preceding decade that led to mill closures and decreased competition. Just in New Bedford, Massachusetts, 20 mills went out of business between 1930 and 1939. The firms that remained found themselves positioned to benefit enormously. The war effort required an immense production of textiles for military use, including powder bags, camouflage cloths, ponchos, and mosquito netting. The large-scale use of parachutes in the war required production of nylon, a relatively new material that was both lightweight and strong. Textile mills were initially hesitant to commit to large-scale production. It was only after Berkshire Fine Spinning made a large commitment that other mills followed suit. Berkshire Fine Spinning alone produced 5 million yards of nylon fabric for the war effort, and it and others found a new outlet for their many languishing spindles and looms. The effect on the northern mills' profitability was apparent, as seen in Figure 1.3. Berkshire's profit margins, which had been slightly negative in the 5 years ended 1939, increased to 4.9% for the 5 years ended 1944. Hathaway Manufacturing experienced even greater gains in profitability. Its net profit margin averaged just 2.8% between 1940 and 1944, which was just 0.7 percentage points higher than the average of the preceding 4 years. But because of Hathaway's greater capital efficiency, it generated an average of $4.04 in revenues per dollar of equity between 1940 and 1944, compared to Berkshire's $2.20 during the same period. Its return on average equity during those years averaged 11.2%, compared to Berkshire's rate of 10.9%. Remember, Berkshire's return on equity from 1935 to 1939 was zero. The latter half of the 1940s saw textile profitability reach greater heights than during the war years. The U.S. economy boomed during the peacetime that followed World War II. Real disposable personal income per capita, a measure of dollars available to consumers to spend, fell from $7,361 in 1929 to $6,468 in 1935. It then grew to $10,754 in 1944, before declining slightly to $9,927 in 1949 as the U.S. entered another recession. The U.S. consumer, with almost a third more income at their disposal in the 1940s than in the previous decade, began spending liberally. Goods formerly eschewed as being unnecessary, such as the fine woven products made by the northern textile mills, were once again in demand. This was the real boom for the Berkshire Hathaway predecessor companies. High sales in the late 1940s led to greater margins. Net margins at the two companies exploded, with Berkshire averaging 12.9% between 1945 and 1949, and Hathaway reaching 7%. The combination of higher revenues and higher margins resulted in a dramatic increase in returns on shareholders' equity. At Berkshire, its return on average equity was 28% per year during the 1945-49 period. Hathaway averaged a slightly lower, though by no means disappointing, 27% per year during that same period. 1950 to 1954. The data on Berkshire Fine Spinning is sparse for this period, so the analysis of the next 5-year period uses the pro forma consolidated financial information provided in the first combined Berkshire Hathaway annual report in 1955. The boom experienced during the 1940s did not exactly go bust in the 1950s, rather it fizzled. The temporary profitability caused by strong demand from World War II and a reinvigorated consumer after the war faded to the background as the fundamental disadvantages of northern textile production became apparent. Beginning in 1950, the Berkshire Hathaway predecessor companies experienced rapid declines in revenues and profitability, as shown in Figure 1.5. Having come from what was the peak of $97 million of combined revenues in 1948, revenues rebounded slightly in 1951 to $92 million, but never recovered. Companies quickly lost their healthy profit margins, too. The decline in northern textile production can also be seen in the statistics of active spindles shown in Figure 1.6. The graph highlights the decline of the industry overall, but shows the South held its ground while the North continues to see losses. While New England states fell from 22% of total active spindles in 1940 to 12% in 1955, the South's share increased from 75% in 1940 to 88% in 1955. It is interesting to note that between 1950 and 1955, the inroads of the South were such that despite the U.S. shrinking overall, it grew the number of active spindles at the expense, of course, of the North. Berkshire Hathaway Incorporated. The final merger that would impart the name on today's modern conglomerate occurred in 1955, when Berkshire Fine Spinning merged with Hathaway Manufacturing. The merger resulted primarily from continued relentless industry pressures, but it was set in motion by a flooding of the Hathaway Mill on Cove Street in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which was significantly damaged by Hurricane Carol in September 1954. Eager to remain in business, Seabury Stanton, Hathaway's leader, pursued a merger with Berkshire Fine Spinning. The merger was finalized on March 14, 1955. Leading the new enterprise were John H. McMahon as chairman of the board, Seabury Stanton as vice chair, and Malcolm G. Chase, Jr. as president. The managers were upbeat, writing in the first annual report in 1955, "The purpose of the combination of the two companies was to effect operating economies and greater diversification of products for each. The new company can now supply the market not only with plain, fine-combed cotton goods, but also with fancy-colored box loom fabrics and with rayon, nylon, dacron, and other synthetic fabrics." Unfortunately, that report also contained a portentous warning. Shortly after the merger in July of that year, a strike caused a 13-week shutdown. The next month, Hurricane Diane severely damaged several plants in Rhode Island. These early episodes would set the stage for the many troubles and tough decisions that would be faced during the ensuing decade. Conclusion. The many corporate mergers that occurred prior to the formation of the combined Berkshire Hathaway Incorporated, as we know it today, created the textile conglomerate. The business had locations throughout New England and was quite large, with combined revenues of over $65 million in 1955. In 1956, the first year after its combination, Berkshire Hathaway was 431st on the Fortune 500 list of the largest U.S. companies, though it was far from being the largest textile company of its day. Constituent companies that labored separately before joining largely faced the same headwinds leading up to the 1955 merger. Early advantages of the North during the 19th century turned into disadvantages in the 20th century as the South built newer, more efficient plants. The North fell further behind as lower labor and energy costs accrued to the South. A major, though temporary, return to profitability after the Great Depression occurred during World War II in the 1940s. The fire the war lit under the economy quickly turned to cinders once it ended. The lower input cost advantages of the South reappeared in full force in the 1950s, leading to renewed industry decline and consolidation in the North. Active spindle data for the country reflects the industry decline as it relates to world events and industry changes, as seen in Figure 1.7. Figure 1.7 shows that in times of tight industry capacity, firms did well. But when supply exceeded demand, excess capacity lowered profits and oftentimes caused the weakest firms to falter and reduce production or close entirely. Geographical differences are also telling. By running multiple shifts, sometimes around the clock, the South rang up a 122.6% utilization rate of its spindles. The North, by contrast, utilized a 78.6%, with Massachusetts the worst at 70.4%. These types of statistics show the advantages the South had over the North and how the South used them to grow profits. The small degrees of advantages in labor costs and better technologies, coupled with high degrees of plant utilization, resulted in a distinctive competitive advantage over the North. As an interesting aside, the accounting practices of the textile mills could also have played a factor in their extended demise. Many mills, in both locations, improperly accounted for depreciation of plant and equipment. This would have made it seem the mills were operating at an economic loss under conditions of apparent profit. It also would have had the effect of distribution of capital that should have been reinvested in plant upkeep and modernization. Proper accounting, of course, would not have prevented the economic reality from taking place, but it might have led to more rationality on the part of mill owners, however, who might have stopped money-losing operations sooner. Despite the clear advantages of the South, textile operations in the North, and New England in particular, did not entirely disappear. Berkshire Hathaway did not cease all operations until 1985. One company, Burlington Industries, even weathered the storm up through the new millennium, struggling mightily along the way with intense foreign competition. The Berkshire Hathaway that existed a decade before Warren Buffett taking control was a melting snowball trying to maintain its size by furiously appending other wet, melting snow. Instead of recognizing the heat and seeking shelter or changing course, the managers of the 1955 Berkshire Hathaway conglomerate stayed on the same path, hoping for a different result. Some managers surely recognized the structural industry changes taking place, but most only knew one business, textiles. It would take one man and a quirk of history to turn a faltering business into one of the world's most admired companies. Lessons. Textile Beginnings to 1954. 1. Knowledge can only confer a temporary advantage to a business. Eventually, all industry participants have access to best practices. Even governmental protections cannot stop the spread of valuable information. 2. Sometimes the second mover has an advantage over the first mover. The South gained an advantage over the North by using the latest know-how when building from scratch. 3. Business mergers cannot alter a fundamentally disadvantaged economic position or trend. The many textile mergers that culminated in the creation of Berkshire Hathaway were the result of a shrinking industry and could delay, not stop, the inevitable. Chapter 2. 1955 to 1964. Introduction. An analyst or shareholder comparing Berkshire Hathaway's 1955 and 1964 annual reports would have come away with two conclusions. First, profitability was down. The company that existed in 1964 earned about half of what was earned in 1955. Second, the company's financial condition, although not necessarily in bad shape, had materially changed. What was formerly a company flush in cash and excess liquid resources at the end of 1954 had become a company with substantially lower levels of cash and marketable securities, about half the investment in physical assets, and some debt. What transpired to cause Berkshire Hathaway to become half of its former self? 1954. Let's turn first to the balance sheet and assess the financial condition of the company that existed at year-end 1954. Because the merger between Berkshire Fine Spinning Associates Incorporated and Hathaway Manufacturing Company was not consummated until 1955, this is actually an accounting look at what the companies would have looked like had they operated as one a year earlier, pro forma to use the modern jargon. The 1955 combined Berkshire Hathaway Incorporated report contained a look back for comparison purposes as shown in Table 2.3. A company's assets can be overly simplified into two general components, short-term assets and long-term assets. Short-term assets fall into three main categories: inventories, in Berkshire's case raw materials such as cotton, silk, and rayon, product in the process of being converted into finished product, and finished goods such as fabric, accounts receivable, monies owed from customers for goods sold on credit, and cash. At the end of 1954, these current assets made up about two-thirds of Berkshire's total assets. Long-term assets, usually grouped under property, plant, and equipment, are the land, buildings, and equipment necessary to run the company. The 1955 Berkshire Hathaway annual report listed the following locations whose land, buildings, and equipment would have been classified under long-term assets: executive offices in Providence, Rhode Island, 2 sales offices in New York City, 9 operating plants, 5 plants in Adams, North Adams, Holyoke, Fall River, and New Bedford, Massachusetts, 3 in Albion, Anthony, and Warren, Rhode Island, and 1 plant in Brattleboro, Vermont, bleachery and dye works in Lonsdale, Rhode Island, curtain factories in Warren, Rhode Island, and Fall River, Massachusetts, a laboratory and machine shop in Warren, Rhode Island. The $17.2 million figure for long-term assets, as shown in Table 2.3, may not seem large today, but adjusting for inflation, it would be equal to over $150 million in 2020 dollars. In short, Berkshire Hathaway, halfway through the 6th decade of the 20th century, owned a lot of property. Looking next to the other side of the balance sheet, we can see how those assets were financed. Again, to grossly simplify a company's funding sources can be grouped into 2 broad categories: owners, otherwise known as equity, and non-owners. The non-owners category can be further delineated into borrowed monies, debt, and spontaneous liabilities, usually short-term funds provided by trade partners and others in the general course of business. In Berkshire's case at year-end 1954, the company's owners recorded an investment of $53.4 million, which financed a substantial portion of its assets. The remaining balance of just 8% was made up of accounts payable, likely owed to the suppliers of raw materials, accrued wages, salaries, and taxes, and a small number of short-term notes payable. At the end of 1954, Berkshire had no long-term debt. In short, its financial condition could be described as excellent. The trouble begins when we start assessing the returns generated by Berkshire's asset base. We will take up this analysis with data from 1955. 1955. Using data from 1954 and 1955, we can assess the return on capital generated by Berkshire. Even though its balance sheet was in good shape early in the decade, its profitability was not, and this would lead in turn to deterioration in its balance sheet. Going into fiscal year 1955, starting September 30th, 1954, the management team at Berkshire Hathaway had $53 million of invested capital. During the next year, Berkshire generated annual revenues of $65.5 million. That sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but remember, revenue is only one side of the picture. Capital it takes to produce that revenue and the margins earned on each dollar of revenue are equally important. In 1955, the ratio of capital to revenues was high, meaning Berkshire was a capital-intensive business. Basically, it took a lot of money to sell a lot of product. Why was Berkshire so capital-intensive? Textile manufacturing required a lot of land and equipment and many production lines, with inventory tied up in each step. Additionally, a portion of its sales were on credit. This required an investment in accounts receivable as it waited to collect cash from customers, and since its material suppliers and employees would not go long without being paid, there were only modest offsetting liabilities to reduce working capital requirements. Berkshire Hathaway reported net income of $301,000 on revenues of $65.5 million in 1955. The resulting net profit margin, or the ratio of net income to revenues, was 0.46%. Every dollar in revenues required an investment of about 81 cents, so to bring in $100 in revenues required approximately $81. Earning 46 cents on each investment of $81 equals a return on capital of about 0.6%. Even in an era of long-term interest rates around 3%, as was the case in the mid-1950s, this was not an inspiring return. A high capital-to-revenues ratio is not necessarily bad in and of itself. There are, of course, many good businesses, such as today's Berkshire Hathaway-owned Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, and Berkshire's utility businesses that use such a model. These modern subsidiaries have higher margins and enjoy some form of protection from competition. Textile business was a commodity business that suffered from high domestic and international competition without any government-sanctioned price protection. As seen in Chapter 1, Berkshire Hathaway also had the added disadvantage of being in New England with high labor and electric costs. Unsurprisingly, margins were thin. In short, it had no competitive advantages. Warren Buffett was not yet associated with Berkshire Hathaway in 1955, but the situation Berkshire found itself in alludes to his future involvement. Berkshire's weak profitability would ultimately attract his attention as a cigar butt stock he could turn around for a quick gain. After he instead went all in on Berkshire, the subpar economics would provide painful but important lessons. He would learn the extreme difficulty in operating a commodity-type business and the benefits of looking for companies with a moat, a metaphor for a sustainable competitive advantage that protected a company's return on capital. Any business can expect ups and downs. Unfortunately for the 1955 Berkshire Hathaway, its problems were both structural and cyclical. Like riding on a roller coaster, Berkshire experienced wild swings in profitability, ultimately headed in one direction: down. It did experience brief respites of actual increases in profitability and returns when the stars aligned, but these too were only temporary. More typically, tough industry conditions were followed by attempts to resize, realign, or retool, followed by a brief period of improved profitability when inventories were low industry-wide, followed by industry overcapacity as firms raced to take advantage of what looked like a return to normal. all against a backdrop of increasing foreign competition. The 1955 annual report contained clues as to the future profitability of the enterprise. In the jointly signed report by Chairman of the Board John H. McMahon, Vice Chairman Seabury Stanton, and President Malcolm G. Chase, Jr., the leaders noted several operational and competitive issues plaguing the company. Reading the report, it was clear Berkshire Hathaway was in a firefight and they were losing. A 13-week strike completely shut down operations mid-year. The strike was resolved with slight concessions that have decreased the difference in labor costs between ourselves and many of our competitors. Additionally, a flood further caused a 3-week shutdown. Even the good news had a bad tinge. Management expected the new federal minimum wage of $1 per hour, up from 75 cents, would help narrow the spread between Berkshire Hathaway's labor cost and those of its southern competitors. But the federal law would be of little help against foreign competitors. They noted the flood of Japanese fabrics coming into the United States in ever-increasing volume, and remarked upon the Japanese labor cost, the equivalent of 15 cents per hour. They hoped governmental action, read import tariffs, would help. Not to end on a down note, the 1955 report concluded with expectations of improved future profitability due to synergies from the newly combined companies, though they didn't use that modern buzzword. McMahon, Stanton, and Chase anticipated that a diversified product line, combined with cost reductions from the newly combined enterprise and relative labor cost parity with the rest of the United States, would result in a return to profitability. Unfortunately, that was not to be. 1956. In 1956, Berkshire Hathaway's management team acquired Bourne Mills of Tiverton, Rhode Island, for $3.4 million to diversify its product line. The Bourne plant was likewise in the textile manufacturing business and produced carded satines, a different product from Berkshire's main lines. The Bourne acquisition also came with a subsidiary that had a wide distribution network reaching into Canada, and Berkshire management thought it might be useful for Berkshire's other products. Year-end results for 1956 provided management with some positive feedback for their capital allocation decisions. The company earned $923,000 that year, though the return on capital was just 1.7%. Industry developments also bolstered their confidence. As a result of the recent increase in wages in the textile industry located in the South, our competitive position has been substantially improved, and we look to the future with confidence, management concluded in the annual report to shareholders. But everything was not well. That same year, cracks were widening in the core business. Labor shortages caused management to consolidate 2 plants in the North Adams, Massachusetts area. This would be the start of a long road of division and plant shutdowns, followed by divestitures. It was the opposite of a growing, prosperous enterprise. The trouble was that the textile business in the United States was stuck in a long, slow decline into oblivion. It would just take a while to get there. 1957. During 1957, in response to depressed market conditions for textiles, Berkshire Hathaway took steps to maintain profitability. It curtailed some production rather than keep workers busy building excess inventories. The company also consolidated operations, eliminating higher-cost plants, and invested in equipment to modernize operations in the remaining plants. In the 1957 letter to shareholders, Chairman Malcolm Chase, Jr. and President Seabury Stanton stated, "With the operating economies resulting from our consolidation and modernization program, your company will be in a strong competitive position, and we expect that profitable operations will be resumed during 1958. It was not a great forecast. 1958. Profits were elusive in 1958. There was a severe depression in the industry, which necessitated numerous additional plant closures. The company closed the Greylock division in North Adams, Massachusetts, the Berkshire division in Adams, Massachusetts, the Holyoke division in Holyoke, Massachusetts, the Fort Dummer division in Brattleboro, Vermont, and the Curtain Factory Repair division in warehouse buildings in Warren, Rhode Island. The 1958 annual report to shareholders made clear that the remaining divisions will be expected to be profitable going forward. Management anticipated operating losses during this reorganization, but expected the cash freed by reducing working capital would help cover reorganization costs and operating losses. But no reorganization could help Berkshire Hathaway get rid of equipment it wasn't using, equipment no one wanted to buy. This is what happens when downsizing amid a systemic industry contraction. Many companies are all trying to sell equipment that no one could put to profitable use. Task was extremely difficult, maybe even impossible. The market for second-hand textile machinery and buildings has been overloaded for the past several years, owing to the large number of mill liquidations which have taken place in all sections of the country, management concluded in the 1958 annual report, and it has been extremely difficult to find customers for our machinery and properties. The year ended in a sea of red ink. The company reported a net loss of $5 million in 1958. 1959. Buoyed by a general economic recovery, the following 2 years brought a brief respite of profitability. Operating costs were lower because of the rationalizing of plant assets in prior years, and textile prices were higher due to low industry-wide inventories. From the horrendous $5 million loss incurred in 1958, the bottom line rebounded to a $1.3 million profit in 1959. This likely gave management the confidence to maintain its policy of reinvesting in the business, where they could take full advantage of all technical improvements. 1960. The 1960 annual report informed owners of a change of business strategy. Management stated that, except for curtain fabrics and handkerchief fabrics, the company's entire production would now be sold in the gray, unfinished state. This would be the operating plan going forward and reduce risk associated with carrying finished goods. The plan appeared to be initially successful. Though sales dropped almost 10%, profits swelled to $4.6 million, a net profit margin of 7.4%, and a return on capital of 12%. Remember, this company had a net margin of 0.6% just 5 years earlier. Spirits were high. Berkshire Hathaway was still debt-free. However, as Buffett would later discover, such high points were a mirage. They merely served to keep everyone, owners and management alike, trudging forward. The 1960 annual report noted an industry slowdown along with the weakening prices, but with low inventories at the manufacturing level, satisfactory operating results were expected in the future. Again, management would be disappointed. It didn't take long for industry conditions to revert to a state of overproduction and low prices. 1961. Management stated in the 1961 annual report that sales volumes dropped materially and prices declined substantially, driven in part by continuous imports of foreign textiles. Revenues declined almost 24% that year to $48 million, and the company reported a $393,000 loss. This was not a terrible result given the significant contraction in revenues, but it was an indication of the pain to come. 1962. Choppy seas continued in 1962 with no signs of calm waters. Costs remained high and the company posted a $2.2 million loss despite a 12% increase in revenues. That was not the worst of it. The company also recorded a $1.4 million charge for the estimated loss on properties to be sold. In effect, it wrote down the value of its soon-to-be divested plant assets, but made the income statement look better, less bad, really, by recording the value as a charge to equity rather than flowing the loss through the income statement. Therefore, what would have been a $3.6 million loss was reduced by an accounting maneuver. This ignored a dangerous undercurrent lurking below the surface. Management's response to the negative industry trends was to again change course, though within the textile industry. A new 3-year modernization program began on August 1, 1962, the beginning of fiscal year 1963. Walking back on its concentration on unfinished products, it ceased unprofitable productions of these gray goods. Initial success in selling finished curtains and handkerchief led management to focus on selling more of those items. They were simple to produce and thus had lower labor costs. For these new products, which had a semi-proprietary interest with less competition, management established a home fabrics division which sold throughout the U.S. and Canada. With hindsight, we can see the relative ease of entry into these finished goods provided no true protection from competition, only a delay of the inevitable. Buffett spoke of this years later in his 1985 chairman's letter, the year Berkshire decided to permanently close the textile division. Should you find yourself in a chronically leaking boat, energy devoted to changing vessels is likely to be more productive than energy devoted to patching leaks. A note of historical significance is appropriate here. Buffett began purchasing shares of Berkshire Hathaway for his investment partnership, Buffett Partners Limited, in 1962. These first shares were purchased for $7.50, which translated into a market capitalization of about $12 million, about one-third of book value and less than working capital. 1963. Reflecting on the year 1963, management reported the company lost $685,000, but that there was a trend toward profitable operations. The company continued to invest in its new home fabrics division, which showed a satisfactory profit. Digging deeper revealed clues that business was much worse than the reported net loss would indicate. The letter to shareholders explained that the company had permanently closed its Valley Falls division and discontinued operations in the Berkshire King Philip A division in Fall River, Massachusetts. What the letter failed to note was a $1.5 million charge to equity, like the one taken in 1962. Had it been recorded in the income statement, the net loss would have ballooned to $2.2 million. 1964. The final year in our decade under review, 1964, again saw mixed results. On the surface, the company had returned to profitability. The company permanently closed its Berkshire King Philip A and E plants in Fall River, Massachusetts, leaving 3 manufacturing plants in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and 1 in Warren, Rhode Island. A small profit of $176,000 was reported, and management told shareholders that all divisions of the company were operating on a profitable basis at the end of the final quarter. Management also noted that the government subsidy program that existed since 1956, which subsidized foreign purchases of U.S. cotton to encourage exports and alleviate surplus production, was altered and allowed U.S. manufacturers to obtain the same discount. If owners had not learned to dig deeper at this point, they should have. Another $3 million write-down to plant assets was recorded to equity. Likewise, if this was included as a true loss, as it most certainly should have been, it would have wiped out the small profit reported that year. Decade in review. With the decade concluded, let's take another assessment of Berkshire Hathaway in 1964. We find a business roughly half the size of its former self and one with a much weaker balance sheet. The shriveled number of offices and plant locations at the end of 1964 illustrates the degree to which the business had contracted over the preceding decade. Save for one plant, operations had contracted to New Bedford, Massachusetts, including the executive offices and laboratory. The company still had 2 sales offices in New York City and 3 home fabric stores in Toronto, New York City, and Los Angeles. The report listed 4 plant locations, though 3 of those, the Hathaway Box Loom Division, the Hathaway Synthetic Division, and the Home Fabrics Division, were in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The 4th was the King Philip D Division, located in Warren, Rhode Island. So what happened over the decade? Between 1955 and 1964, Berkshire Hathaway generated aggregate revenues of $595 million, yet its shareholders were punished for this with 5 separate years of losses that outstripped any profits made in better years. Worse yet, if the below-the-line write-downs to plant and equipment taken in 1962 through 1964 are included, the true economic result is even worse. Aside from the Bourne Mills acquisition in 1956, management acted rationally in shrinking the business rather than continuing to acquire other mills in hopes of finding ever-elusive synergies. Over the course of the 10 years ended in 1964, a net of $22.3 million, or about 42% of shareholders' equity from the beginning of the period, was sent to shareholders in the form of dividends and share repurchases. Approximately $1.1 million of positive adjustments to equity were recorded over the decade relating to positive tax adjustments and an excess of assets acquired over the purchase price of the Bourne Mills acquisition. Another key capital allocation decision, or rather a series of decisions, should be noted. Although management did shrink the company's investment in property, plant, and equipment over the decade, it had to spend money maintaining its fixed assets and investing in the latest technologies. Those decisions were expensive. Even though net property, plant, and equipment shrunk due to scaled-back operations, just maintaining existing equipment cost $14 million over that time. In short, management initially tried to make a go of it in the textile business by investing in new technology and merging with other mills. Instead, it found contraction, basically by half, was the only means of survival. The Berkshire Hathaway that existed in 1964 was basically the same undiversified textile manufacturer that existed decades before. The business required large amounts of capital, had high labor requirements, and experienced low profits. In sum, it was a poor business in an industry whose glory days had passed. Over the decades preceding Buffett's control, Berkshire Hathaway and its predecessors suffered a long, slow decline in operating performance. Cause of the deterioration is generally attributed to a commoditization of the industry coupled with intense competition. While attempts were made to remain competitive, such as cutting expenses and investing in more efficient machinery, the efforts were futile. In addition to strong competition from other American textile manufacturers, there was also overseas competitors. American textile manufacturers in the South were destined to suffer intensely from competition overseas, but the fact remained that both groups of domestic and foreign competitors had advantages over Berkshire Hathaway. The main advantage to an overseas textile manufacturer in the 1950s and 1960s was a familiar culprit: low labor costs. Advances in the logistics of global commerce, coupled with know-how from experts worldwide, created favorable economics for importing textiles to the United States. American textile manufacturers countered this trend with investments in more efficient machinery, but to no avail. Compounding this general melee was the fact that Berkshire Hathaway was a New England-based company. Differences in electricity costs between the Northeast and South meant Berkshire was at an added disadvantage, and since textiles were, as Charlie Munger noted later, just congealed electricity, the only way to compete was with better technology. Well, because that better technology was available to all competitors, the playing field was leveled. Buffett would later comment in the 1985 annual report on the illusory benefits of such capital investments. Viewed individually, each company's capital investment decision appeared cost-effective and rational. Viewed collectively, the decisions neutralized each other and were irrational, just as happens when each person watching a parade decides he can see a little better if he stands on tiptoes. After each round of investment, all the players had more money in the game, and returns remained anemic. In sum, all the gains from the investment flowed to the customer in the form of lower prices. Very little, if any at all, ended up, as Charlie Munger later said, sticking to the ribs of owners. If Berkshire Hathaway was to avoid a repeat of the decade ending in 1964, he would have to change course entirely, not just do something different within the textile industry. Fortunately for shareholders of Berkshire Hathaway going into 1965, Warren Buffett was about to enter the scene. Things would be very different going forward. Lessons: 1955 through 1964. 1. Qualitative indicators can lead to clues about a business's future. 2. The newest technology won't necessarily help a business in terms of profitability if that technology is available to all industry participants and that industry is commoditized. 3. Owners should always dig deeper into financial statements. Even if plant write-downs recorded in 1962, 1963, and 1964 were in accordance with accounting principles at the time, they were not trivial amounts. Management should have explained why $5.9 million was chopped off the value of their investment in property, plant, and equipment over 3 years. 4. Capital-intensive businesses can be difficult if not protected by meaningful competitive advantages. With high amounts of capital required to generate each dollar of revenues, declining margins translate to declining returns on capital more forcefully. 5. Profit margins are important, but their absolute level is relatively unimportant. The more important metric is return on capital. A low-margin business can produce a satisfactory return on capital provided capital requirements are low. Conversely, a business requiring a lot of capital can produce a satisfactory return if it achieves high margins. A business requiring a large capital investment with low margins, like the textile business during this decade, in an industry with surplus capacity and competitive disadvantages, was doomed. Chapter 3, 1965 to 1974. Introduction. A mere 12.5 cents set off the long chain of events that led Warren Buffett to go all in on Berkshire Hathaway and ensured its and his place in history. Buffett first acquired shares in Berkshire for his investing partnership, Buffett Partnership Limited, using a playbook executed countless times before. Find a business selling for less than its liquidating value and wait for a temporary market correction to sell at a profit. Berkshire had a history of share repurchases that Buffett saw as a catalyst to monetize his current holdings. He anticipated future repurchases and even struck what he thought was a deal with Seabury Stanton to tender his partnership shares for $11.50 per share. The official offer came back at $11.375, or 12.5 cents less. Feeling slighted, Buffett set out to seek control of Berkshire. Buffett made additional stock purchases on behalf of himself and his partnership and gained the support of other existing shareholders, including Otis Stanton, Seabury's brother, and the Chase family. On May 10, 1965, Seabury and his son, Jack, resigned. The board immediately gave Warren Buffett control and placed Ken Chase in charge of operations. Berkshire thus became another investment vehicle through which Buffett could allocate capital. Berkshire became Buffett's primary investment vehicle when he wound down Buffett Partnership Limited in 1969. Buffett took a deep value approach to investing, and the rise of the Nifty 50 and other high-priced growth stocks in the 1960s were completely at odds with that. He and some of the partners took Berkshire shares distributed during the liquidation of the partnership. Aside from some other outside investments, which we will see eventually work their way into Berkshire, Berkshire Hathaway remained as a permanent base of capital, the foundation on which Buffett's future business deals would be placed. The first decade of Berkshire Hathaway under Warren Buffett's control, 1965 to 1974, is in some respects the most important. Like a caterpillar that morphs into a butterfly, Berkshire began a transition from a textile company to a conglomerate almost unrecognizable from its former self. Warren Buffett would learn many lessons during this decade, from the difficulty of commodity businesses to the benefit of starting with a good business. Buffett proved that over a relatively short period of time and with a careful guiding hand, skillful capital allocation could help any business reach its highest potential. Also, he demonstrated that capital was fungible commodity, not predestined to remain in the business or industry where it was originally invested. 1965. The 1965 Berkshire Hathaway letter to shareholders, although signed by Chairman Malcolm Chase and President Kenneth Chase, no relation, was written by Warren Buffett. Reading that letter, one can begin to see Buffett's subtle influence, starting with his communication to shareholders. From the beginning, Buffett was transparent about company finances, sharing financial details usually hidden within the below-the-line charges to shield the income statements from taking a hit. He also explicitly explained an important accounting change that would provide a more realistic but less rosy view of the financial picture. In the very first paragraph, the reader learns that the earnings as reported do not contain any non-recurring losses sustained from closing two plants. The second paragraph of the letter alerts shareholders to an important accounting change. Because of losses incurred in previous years, Berkshire did not have to pay federal income taxes on its pre-tax earnings of $4.3 million in 1965. Reporting Berkshire's profits without taxes, however, might mislead shareholders as to the true earning power of their company. An estimate of taxes that would have been payable without the loss carryovers was therefore deducted. The $2 million charge, equivalent to federal income taxes, reduced reported net earnings to $2.3 million. Though subtle, the fact that a manager would intentionally choose to report earnings almost 50% lower than they could have was a loud signal to those paying attention. It was also in marked contrast to accounting practice of the previous decade, whereby below-the-line charges were taken to equity. This had shielded the income statements from reporting losses on disposed plant and equipment, keeping shareholders out of the loop. Buffett chose the reverse. The charge taken for taxes was not actually payable due to the loss carryovers, and it was added back to equity in the reconciliation of accounts. Operationally, Berkshire performed better in 1965. Revenues were flat compared to 1964 at $49.3 million, though profits grew to $2.3 million pre-tax. In the letter to shareholders, Buffett noted a substantial reduction to overhead, and the company continued its program of investing in new technology to reduce costs and improve quality. Importantly, the economic results during the year represented a much improved return on equity of 9.8%. Together, the profits and capital freed as a result of reducing inventories allowed Berkshire to pay off $2.5 million in bank loans and repurchase 120,231 of its outstanding shares, or over 10% of the company. Buffett, the capital allocator, had arrived. 1966. On the surface, the year 1966 looked very similar to the prior year. Revenues totaled $49.4 million compared to $49.3 million in 1965. Operating profit was up modestly to $4.8 million from $4.7 million, but difficulties remained. Let's start with the product mix. Sales in the synthetics division fell, though home fabrics increased. Box loom gained, while sales within the King Philip D division slackened. Then the worst news. The latter half of 1966 was one of generally depressed markets. Not a good turn of events for an industry with generally depressed sales. This story was unfortunately familiar. Overproduction in acetate fabrics and imports of nylon created oversupply. Anticipating future pain, the 1966 annual report noted that given the preceding weakness in synthetics, competitors were likely to increase cotton production. This would hurt the company's King Philip D division. Rather than keep running at full steam, the company curtailed production for a week during October 1966 and noted that further shutdowns might be necessary to avoid inventory buildup. Continued development in the new home fabrics products, a bright spot during the year, was meant to counter those slowdowns. But growth has a cost and would entail additional investment in inventories and receivables. It was the same old story, but one worth repeating. It takes money to make money. How much money? Buffett estimated up to $7 million. Buffett operated the company under a policy of self-sufficiency, both for philosophical reasons and because of the challenges of the textile industry. He said outside funding was virtually unobtainable, which was one reason Berkshire maintained reserves of cash and marketable securities to have resources on hand. Present uncertainties such as war, tax rates, and decreased level of business activity also all combined to emphasize the continuing need for a strong financial condition, he wrote. It's worth noting that this approach has never changed, and neither have the uncertainties, though diversification has lessened the risk to the overall enterprise. The 1966 annual report concludes with a section entitled Dividends. Due to the state of the company's balance sheet and the fact that it was profitable, Berkshire declared a dividend of 10 cents per share. This dividend, payable in 1967, was the last the company would pay, and likely will ever pay, under Buffett's control. Buffett would later codify his thinking into a principle. Capital under his stewardship was best retained if Berkshire could deliver more than $1 of market value for each dollar of retained earnings, he explained. Paying a dividend not only deprived shareholders of the ability to have that dollar remain and compound on their behalf, but was also tax inefficient. 1967. The trouble anticipated the prior year was realized in 1967. In response to steep declines in sales volumes and pricing, Berkshire cut production by 15% to avoid building up inventories, but cutting production created another problem: the loss of trained labor. Because it couldn't afford to maintain idle employees on the payroll while waiting for good times to return, if they returned at all, Berkshire was forced to lay off skilled labor. If Berkshire ramped up production in the future, it would face higher training costs to onboard new employees. The ongoing weakness in the market for textiles necessitated the closing of another plant in 1967. King Philip D plant in Warren, Rhode Island, which had a one-week shutdown in 1966 to avoid building excess inventories, closed permanently. The plant efficiently manufactured fine-combed lawns. There was no longer demand for the product, as cotton long products were being replaced by polyester blend fabrics. Further, there was little to no adaptability of the equipment for new uses. There were some bright spots in textiles. The The home fabrics division expanded to a wider variety of fabrics, and Berkshire began an apparel fabrics division which sold finished yarn products into the women's apparel market. Both were profitable, but since the production orders were smaller and required more loom shifts, higher manufacturing costs reduced profits. By Buffett's own admission, company management and employees were hardworking and creative individuals. Insurance. Buffett started allocating capital outside of the textile business and in doing so changed the face of Berkshire Hathaway forever. The seminal event in 1967 was the acquisition of National Indemnity Company and its sister company, National Fire and Marine Insurance Company, considered together as National Indemnity. The purchase of National Indemnity was perhaps the most important event in Berkshire's history, as it would provide a strong platform for future growth. More immediately, it provided an outlet for the cash freed up by shrinking Berkshire's textile operations. Jack Ringwalt and his brother Arthur founded National Indemnity in 1940. It was an unusual insurance company. Product didn't make it unusual. Insurance was and is commoditized business with almost free entry. What made National Indemnity different was its philosophy of insuring risks other insurers rejected. The company began by insuring taxis. In addition to less-than-perfect drivers, the bulk of its business, the company insured risks others shunned entirely. The philosophy is best summed up by a quote from Jack Ringwalt: "There's no such thing as a bad risk, only bad rates." Ringwalt was willing to insure almost any risk given an appropriate price. This included circus performers and lion tamers. Even with more traditional risks, the insurance industry was like a pendulum, swinging between cycles of optimism and pessimism. National Indemnity's willingness to accept higher risks at higher rates led to doing business when others walked away. It was a strategy built on discipline and a relentless attention to minimizing costs. It is no wonder Buffett was impressed. Buffett was no stranger to insurance. He famously took a trip to Washington, D.C. as a Columbia University student to learn more about Geico, which would later play a starring role at Berkshire. After the visit, Buffett penned "The Security I Like Best," featuring Geico. National Indemnity operated in a different risk pool than Geico, which focused on government employees with good driving records. But it had the basic characteristic of all insurance companies: a bucket of capital Buffett could allocate into undervalued businesses. National Indemnity was on Buffett's radar because of its headquarters in his hometown of Omaha. Buffett knew Ringwalt and had even tried unsuccessfully to persuade him to invest in the Buffett partnership years earlier. This time Buffett wanted to buy. He liked Ringwalt's reputation as a manager and understood the business well. When an opportunity arose to buy National Indemnity, Buffett pounced. He also persuaded Ringwalt to stay on to manage the business, an acquisition strategy he became known for, and developed a friendship with him. Buffett agreed to pay $8.6 million for National Indemnity at a $1.9 million premium over the tangible net worth of the company. Why would Buffett, whose personal fortune through that time was made largely by buying companies for less than their net worth, pay almost a 30% premium? The answer lay in the nature of the business and in Ringwalt. Insurance is unlike most other businesses in that its assets are almost entirely comprised of securities. In the most basic construction of an insurance company balance sheet, its assets are funded by policyholders, unearned premiums and claims waiting to be paid, and the balance is shareholders' equity. Buying National Indemnity with Berkshire Hathaway meant Berkshire could allocate capital into securities it would buy anyway, and, for a modest premium, also gain access to a well-run insurance operation. If Ringwalt, the expert insurance operator, could continue to earn an underwriting profit, those profits would pay for the upfront premium. Any additional gains Buffett could achieve by putting to work the $19.4 million of investable float, explained more fully in the section on 1968, would be gravy. With hindsight, we know this was one of the most important and attractive business acquisitions in Berkshire's history. But even Buffett admits it took him a while to realize just how good a deal National Indemnity was. The 1967 annual report had little discussion of insurance company financial operations. Berkshire's 1967 consolidated statement of earnings reported only National Indemnity's after-tax income, a $791,938 equity in earnings of unconsolidated subsidiaries. The report also disclosed a $100,147 after-tax realized investment gain attributable to National Indemnity's investment portfolio. Still, one sentence in the insurance discussion stood out. All earnings of the insurance subsidiaries are being retained to build additional capital strength. It was a reminder that the dividends of 1967 would not return because Buffett's strategy was to invest in growth to bring more value to shareholders. One final note should be made about 1967. Effective December 30th, 1967, Berkshire changed its accounting year to a calendar year. As a result, the annual report for 1967 covered 15 months. It reported the results for the 12 months that ended September 30th, 1967, and the stub, 3-month period ending December 31st, 1967. Efforts were made to provide shareholders with comparative figures to allow proper insight into business operations. 1968. The 1968 letter to shareholders led off with a short 2-sentence paragraph starting this way. Total operating earnings in relation to stockholders' investments still are not satisfactory. Buffett was alerting shareholders that in investing, it's not the absolute level of profits that matter, it's whether the earnings are appropriate in relation to the amount invested. Berkshire's return on average shareholders' equity that year was 13.8%. That was not a poor result, and it was certainly better than Berkshire was accustomed to earning, but it was still below what Buffett considered satisfactory. Textiles. Results for 1968 were separated into 2 paragraphs each for textiles and insurance, plus 2 additional paragraphs under a section titled Marketable Securities and Acquisitions. Textiles that year were not surprisingly mixed. Revenues were up 14% to $46 million, led by home fabrics and menswear linings. The report pointed out that those areas were historically the most consistently profitable. Perhaps because of this, Berkshire had installed a new 150-inch loom for the coming year. Berkshire also held options on additional looms should volume materialize. The box loom division was not part of that growth. Unlike Berkshire's more finished lines, the box loom division had historically suffered due to heavy imports and weak prices. Rather than continuing operations in this area, Berkshire decided to phase out its operations of greige goods, raw textiles that are woven though not yet dyed or bleached. Additional losses from this division were forecast, though Berkshire anticipated improved overall results from textiles because of the change in strategy. Insurance. The space devoted to commenting on the new insurance division, 2 paragraphs like the textile division, clearly understated Buffett's enthusiasm for this new line of business. The division was performing so well that Berkshire would invest additional equity capital into operations and lay off less risk to reinsurers. Reinsurers essentially buy a portion of the volume of business written by the primary insurer so that the primary insurer can continue to write business at levels appropriate in relation to its capital. Buffett even suggested the possibility of entering the reinsurance field in the future. After praising Jack Ringwalt for delivering a splendid operating performance, Buffett explained the operating philosophy and strategy for the group. The focus would be on operating profits, not volume or market share. It was possible to operate at an underwriting loss like the industry as a whole and make up the difference with investment income. But Berkshire's insurance operations would seek underwriting profits first and foremost. It's worth noting that Berkshire still employs this strategy. The financial disclosures for the insurance group in the 1968 letter were decidedly wanting. Despite owning 99% of the insurance businesses, the results were not consolidated with the parent company financial statements. Instead, a line item on the balance sheet indicated an investment in unconsolidated subsidiaries of approximately $12.8 million, and the income statement only contained a line item for equity in earnings of unconsolidated insurance companies of $1.79 million, operating profits after tax, and $707,000 of after-tax investment gains. It is unclear why more detailed results for the insurance group were not presented in 1968. However, complete statements for National Indemnity were included in 1969, with 1968 presented for comparison. Shareholders reading the 1968 annual report did not have the benefit of more detail, though fortunately we can examine each business more thoroughly during our review. We will not venture into the fine detail of each insurance business, but will instead look at the combined operations of the two subsidiaries as if they were one. Still, remember that National Fire and Marine was about 1/10 the size of National Indemnity, premiums earned of $2.3 million, compared to National Indemnity's $20.3 million. In 1968, combined premiums earned were just over $22.6 million. Net premiums written as a percentage of average equity were 221%. The insurance group was writing a significant volume of business. More importantly, it was being written profitably. The single most important measure of profitability for an insurance company is captured in what is called the combined ratio. The combined ratio is made up of the loss ratio, amounts paid out to cover losses to insureds, and the expense ratio, expenses incurred to conduct operations and write additional premium volume, such as salaries and rent. In 1968, these ratios were 65.4% loss ratio and 32.1% expenses, producing a combined ratio of 97.5%. It may seem counterintuitive, but a ratio below 100% is generally good and means an insurer is operating an underwriting profit. In this case, Berkshire got to keep 2.5% of the insurance premiums it took in from policyholders, in addition to money earned from investing those funds. It was not uncommon for insurers then and now to operate at an underwriting loss so long as investment earnings produced a satisfactory overall result. These investment operations are conducted with the monies collected by policyholders, but not yet paid out in claims. This pool of funds is called float and can contribute an enormous amount of value to an insurance operation, since any profits from investing float accrues to the insurer. It is often self-serving for the managers of an insurance business to think they can write unprofitable business and therefore capture more market share and make it up in the investment operations. While this strategy could work, most insurance executives are poor investment professionals since they lack training in that area. These two tendencies combine to produce subpar results for many insurance industry shareholders. Fortunately for Berkshire Hathaway shareholders, they had a profitable underwriting operation and a world-class investor working for them. Concluding the 1968 annual report was a note on two acquisitions completed just after the year ended. At the beginning of 1969, Berkshire acquired 100% of Sun Newspapers and its related printing business, Blacker Printing Company, both based in Buffett's hometown of Omaha, Nebraska. The newspaper business of today pales in comparison to the industry that existed several decades ago. Back then, the business was profitable with high returns on capital for dominant papers. Buffett would build on this initial foray into the industry to earn strong profits for Berkshire shareholders. 1969. The Berkshire Hathaway of earlier years could not call itself a conglomerate, but the present company could. Buffett wanted shareholders to understand why this classification was so important and did so by opening the 1969 letter with a discussion of business strategy. 4 years ago, your management committed itself to the development of more substantial and more consistent earning power than appeared possible if capital continued to be invested exclusively in the textile industry. The paragraph goes on to explain that through two major acquisitions, the insurance subsidiaries and a banking subsidiary acquired in early 1969, Berkshire averaged about a 10% return on shareholders' equity. This included the returns from the textile division, which were below 5%. For these reasons, the letter referred to the relatively new conglomerate as reasonably successful when compared to other textile companies that remained or expanded solely in the textile industry. The underlying suggestion was clear. True success in textiles only would be hard or impossible to find. Textiles. Despite this, textiles remains Berkshire's primary business operation, at least for now, and led off the first section of the letter. Not surprising for shareholders, textile sales in 1969 declined 12.1% to $40.4 million. The box loom division was shut down, causing substantial operating losses. The industry was in the throes of a recession worse than had been seen in many years because of an overall lack of demand. In addition to closing the box loom division, Textile Group management instituted 2-week shutdown periods to avoid building excess inventories. If a business believes demand will return in relatively short order, it may continue to produce product and store it for later sale. This keeps employees busy but requires additional capital investment. Considering the severity of the 1969 slowdown, this would not have been wise. Even with the losses from box loom, the textile segment, after taxes, reported only a slight decrease in earnings from $1.6 million in 1968 to $1.5 million a year later. Insurance. Buffett led the insurance operations segment of his letter with praise for Jack Ringwalt and his team. Buffett may have already been following his mantra of praise by name, criticized by category. Under Ringwalt's leadership, Berkshire Insurance Operations produced an underwriting profit compared to the substantial underwriting losses for the fire and casualty insurance industry. This was a direct result of Ringwalt's policy of underwriting for a profit and not just for volume. Recall the strategy discussion from 1968. One interesting note as it pertains to Buffett's statement on underwriting profits is that the letter states the figure was an adjusted amount. This contrasted to the financial statements which showed a combined National Indemnity Insurance Company and National Fire and Marine Insurance Company pre-tax underwriting loss of about $153,000. This is when it pays to read the fine print. The notes to the financial statements for the insurance company contain the likely answer to those conflicting statements. Note 1. The basis of presentation states that the financials are presented using insurance accounting principles rather than generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP. While there are many specifics as to how these differ, the main takeaway is that insurance industry reporting standards are stricter, in other words, more conservative. A specific item worth noting from Note 1 is, while premium income is recorded pro rata over the period of the policy, the costs associated with writing the business are expensed immediately. Buffett knew that despite reporting losses that year, the business the insurance segment was underwriting would likely generate a profit over the lives of the policies. Spending money to bring in more business caused expenses to balloon, and there was no accounting convention for separating money spent on expansion versus those for maintaining existing levels of business. Buffett needed shareholders to understand that Berkshire was investing in its insurance businesses with the expectation of future profit, reported profits falling where they may. A look at the combined ratio, which was below 100%, indicates a profitable year. A new surety department was doing well. It entered workmen's compensation insurance with an office in Los Angeles, California, and its reinsurance division was off to a strong start. Commenting on the latter, Buffett wrote that due to the nature of the business, it would take years before an intelligent verdict could be rendered. Berkshire had plans for a new home state insurance operation, an insurance company operating in one state for regulatory reasons, and concluded, expectations are for continued growth in our insurance operations. Insurance results for 1969 illustrate Buffett's excitement about the segment. Premiums were growing at a double-digit rate and the business was profitable, as judging by the sub-100% combined ratio. It's worth pausing to discuss the two premium figures contained in Table 3.3. Premiums written reflect the amount of business written during any given year. These are a direct consequence of the insurance company's sales force. Premiums earned are different. A policy written today that covers the next 2 years will be reflected in today's written results, but half will not be earned until the next year. Therefore, it takes many years for underwriting skill to become apparent. Anyone can write a policy, but it takes an intelligent manager to write profitable business today while looking at tomorrow's risks. Another major reason insurance premiums earned might differ from those written is due to reinsurance. Reinsurance is simply the practice of laying off or ceding some of the written policies to another insurer. This allows an insurance company to share some of the risk it undertakes and maximize its sales force. In general, salespeople like writing business and don't like to stop because the insurer has too many policies on the books. The amount of reinsurance can vary from substantial to negligible or nothing at all, depending upon the need or desire to diversify or maintain capital levels. Berkshire would not only look to retain the business it was writing, but grow naturally by taking on additional risk through its own reinsurance operations. In its inaugural year, Berkshire wrote $2.7 million of reinsurance business. Banking. The major acquisition of 1969 was the purchase of the Illinois National Bank and Trust Company. Banking, like insurance, involves prudently managing risks that take time to materialize. A bank's long-term record tells a compelling story. Buffett provided a short history of the bank for shareholders, which is worth repeating here. This bank had been built by Eugene Abegg without addition of outside capital from $250,000 of net worth and $400,000 of deposits in 1931 to $17 million of net worth and $100 million of deposits in 1969. Mr. Abegg has continued as chairman and produced record operating earnings, before security losses, of approximately $2 million in 1969. Such earnings as a percentage of either deposits or total assets are close to the top among larger commercial banks in the country, which are not primarily trust department operations. To achieve such a growth rate over the preceding 38 years would have required an almost 12% return on equity and an annual growth rate of 15.6% in the deposit base. Given the long history of sound and profitable operations, Buffett could rightfully conclude that, like Ringwalt, Abegg knew what he was doing. The purchase price of the bank was not detailed, but we can back into it using the financial information contained in the annual report. See Table 3.4. This information shows that Berkshire paid approximately 1.05 times book value for the bank, a very attractive price given the quality of the bank. This came to $17.7 million. Buffett used Berkshire's now strengthened balance sheet to fund the purchase of the bank. Marketable securities were almost completely sold, raising approximately $11 million. The shrinking textile operations provided almost $4.6 million through reductions in working capital and physical plant investment. Berkshire also augmented its funds by borrowing an additional $4.75 million. Berkshire, under the leadership of Warren Buffett, was becoming a very different company. 1970. Berkshire's mix of businesses produced equally mixed results in 1970. Its newly acquired bank did very well, insurance was mixed, and textiles were, unsurprisingly, mediocre. Textiles. Still, the textile division's management team deserved compliments. Calling out Ken Chase by name, Buffett praised Chase and his group for their efforts to turn around the division while swimming against a strong tide. That tide was the confluence of factors making the economics of textiles in New England unsustainable: high relative labor and electricity costs, coupled with stiff overseas competition. In response to poor demand in both menswear linings and home fabrics, the division reduced production. This meant making sure inventories did not grow too far out of line from current sales levels. Over the preceding 5 years, inventories had averaged 25% of sales. With sales down 39% to $24.6 million in 1970, the ratio ballooned to 34%. Fluctuations in sales are not atypical in business, and if a manager expected to return to higher sales levels, inventories might be maintained at the same dollar levels as before. With textiles, though, a commodity whose finished products were subject to style trends, expensive to make, and where demand had dropped over time, waiting was not an option. Despite the large drop in sales, the division eked out a tiny $107,000 profit, a good result relative to the large drop in sales, and certainly better than a loss, but far from satisfactory in relation to the capital employed in the business, $11.1 million in average non-cash working capital and $2.8 million in average property, plant, and equipment. Insurance. The insurance segment turned in mixed, though generally satisfactory results in 1970. Buffett said growth was outstanding, with premiums written and earned up over 55% to $45 million and $39 million respectively. That included $7 million of written premiums in the reinsurance segment, over 2.5 times the volume done the year before, but he was quick to point out that growth in premiums was accompanied by a somewhat poor underwriting picture. This led to an underwriting loss of $330,000 for the insurance group, which meant that any earnings from the segment had to come from investing. It is clear Buffett's enthusiasm for insurance remained strong despite the higher loss ratio. This is because he understood how the business worked. The operating philosophy of National Indemnity was to catch waves of business when it became profitable. That year, a surge of volume resulted from more restricted markets, meaning other insurance companies pulling back after losing money. Ringwalt's development of home state insurance operations in 1970 signal the future operational mantra of Buffett and Berkshire. The first operation was Cornhusker Casualty Company in Nebraska, a 100% owned subsidiary of National Indemnity. It wrote premiums of $249,000 that year. Buffett noted its big company capability and small company accessibility, demonstrating the advantages of decentralized operations. Today, decentralization is the operating philosophy in all of Berkshire's operations. As the Berkshire Annual Reports would later remark, Berkshire's operations are managed via delegation just shy of abdication. If readers were not yet convinced of Buffett's enthusiasm for this operation and for Ringwalt, Buffett let them know first that Ringwalt brought the concept to life and that there were plans to form more companies under the home state banner. Banking. Turning to Berkshire's new banking operation, Buffett was all praise for Illinois National Bank. He noted that the bank's operating return was the sign of an exceptionally well-managed banking business. The bank earned a strong 1.9% return on average assets, ROA, in 1970. It's worth pausing to note that while a 1.9% return may appear very low on an absolute basis, even lower than that of basic savings account at the time, the economics of banking are such that